church was built because they needed a place. They needed a place for the people to gather. There were 3 or 4 structures before Kaiahao, and they were with posts and the hut type with leaves, pili probably, or even coconut leaves. And it was just a shelter above from the sun. Then they decided it was time to build a church. And so they went through that. And the church was built. But behind the church is a road, and probably was just a path at one time. And it passes behind the advertiser building. And in that vicinity was a pool, they said belonged to Ha'o, a chief in the area. And the name was Kawai, the water of Ha'o, or the pool of Ha'o. He came down to this pool for his baths, probably, his family, and for purification ceremonies. And so that area was called Kaiahao. And so when the church was built, they named it Kaiahao, because the most interesting thing in that area was the pool of Kaiahao. Many years later, when the church was refurbished, got rid of the termites, and they rebuilt the inside, that a rock was removed from this pool and put up as a fountain there in the churchyard presently. And it's called Kaiahao. And I'm glad I went. And the people...
Violet Leilani Hughes had a childhood rich in the ways of the Hawaiian people. She learned about herbs from her mother, about life from adults around her, and stories from her tutu.
Very precious. She needs it. As a child, we spoke Hawaiian. That was my first language. And I was told that Tutu didn't speak any English. That is, she didn't appreciate it if you spoke to her in English. So when she came, my mother said, you sit with Tutu. And sit with Tutu meant you stayed right there, and Tutu would ask questions or sometimes ask for a glass of water, and then many times make comments about birds that fly by. And one day she said to me, out of the clear blue, she said, if ever you are asked, and you might be asked, what line does your family come from? And you are to answer, mai kalo'ikalo mai mako, meaning you are from the taro patch. And it's only as I grew up and started to read did I realize what a message there was in that story. She was referring to the story of Ha'aloa, and that all of us, if we have any Hawaiian, started in the lo'ikalo. We all came from the same source, whether you were a li'i or commoner, where she was going back to the very beginning of man, or the very beginning of the Hawaiian race. That was tremendous, I thought. Chosen.
One of Violet's greatest pleasures is storytelling.
Did you like that
The
story?
Hawaiian culture is ripe with such stories that have been passed down for generations.
So we have to watch.
Some of the stories are centuries old and are closely related to legends of the South Pacific Islands, while others originated in Hawaii. In addition to stories about their gods, the Hawaiians tell stories, old and new, about their aumakua, their ancestral guardian spirits who are worshipped and invoked in time of crisis. For example, Violet's tutu told her about their aumakua, pueo, or Hawaiian owl, and how it aided family members. Violet also has a story, a true story about how a pueo helped save the life of her granddaughter.
She was with a team that was going to be paddling from Molokai to Oahu. And it was just about dusk when someone said they had forgotten to pick something up in Kaunakakai. This was on Molokai. And so she said, well, I'll go and get it. So she got up, and it was a pickup truck, and she drove into Kaunakakai. And she said there was no one on the road. So she said she took the middle of the road and driving and making some turns, going up. And she said, all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, this pueo came out of the bushes. She said, it startled her. And she said it was so large that for a second she couldn't see through the windshield. So she moved over to one side, and just at that moment, a car passed her on that left side. And so she said, you know, Tutu, I could have been smashed right into that car, or it could have smashed into me. And so she came home. She was nervous about that. She came home and told me and told her mother. And I told her, well, my tutu's aumakua was a pueo. So you had somebody looking after you then.
For the Hawaiians, storytelling is both an art and an expression of spirituality. In early times, sacred stories, those about the gods, were told only during the day, and listeners could not move in front of the speaker, for to do so would be disrespectful to the gods. Many stories also illustrate the Hawaiian people's extraordinary relationship with nature. Violet Hughes is intimately familiar with this relationship, and stories told to her by her mother and through her own experience.
My mother told me this story. Must have been about 10 years old when she told me this one. But she told me about being taken with her mother. She didn't tell me where, but if she was a child growing up, then this would have been on Maui. And she said when she was a little girl, her mother took her and told her before they left, gave her all the instructions. You have to sit quietly, you can't move. If you want to sleep, you just lie down. Put your head on my lap or up against me, but you're not to move. You're not to ask for water, you're not to ask for anything to eat, you're not to ask to leave. And so she said she was prepared. And then they went in, and she said they had a hole dug in this area and a young banana plant. And all of them started to pray. And then the tree was put into the puka, you know, to be planted. And after it was put in there, the prayer continued. And they did it in unison and then individually sometimes. But it was a continuous prayer. And she said she fell asleep and then awakened, and they were still praying. And she noticed that that little banana plant had started to grow. And she watched for a while, nothing happened. She fell asleep. And when she awakened, it had grown a little taller. And this continued until she saw a grown banana tree. And she said the next thing she knew, and it was at night, she said this banana tree was going to have a flower. But the prayer kept right on. And she said, and finally there was light. There was banana on the bunch, and it began to ripen. And by midday, she said you could see the bananas were ready to eat practically. After a while, people stopped praying, and then they picked the ripe bananas, and she ate it. She shared her mother's banana. Because my question was, you sure it was the same tree? They didn't put another tree? She said, no. No one moved. They were all there. And we ate the banana.
And that was way out of...
Violet Hughes shares her knowledge of Hawaii through storytelling. She passes on a lifetime of learning, perpetuating stories passed on to her, and stories based on her own experiences.
Can't run that fast in sand and going up.
I was maybe 9 or 10. It was my first trip to Maui to stay with my tutu. And at night when we went to bed, she didn't have electricity either. She had just a lamp. And she told me to sleep on the coral bed. And I was a huge coral bed. And I noticed that she had her moina, her mat on the floor, a sleeping mat, and she had a pillow on the floor and a little kihei. And when it was time to go to sleep, she just turned the wick down, and I knew, well, this is time you have to go to sleep. I fell asleep. But during the night sometime, and I had no idea whether it was morning or middle of the night or late evening, but I was awakened by a sound, and I didn't know what the sound was. So I started to move, and as I started to move, her arm flung out and kept me down. So I knew then I was not to say anything. I was not to move. And I could hear sounds in the distance. And I thought that couldn't have awakened me, but I listened. And there was drum, was one of the things I heard. And then there was music. It wasn't a guitar ukulele, but it was kind of a wind instrument, I assumed. And it sounded nice. It sounded Hawaiian. And it kept getting louder. And the interesting thing was, it seemed to be coming from Mauka, uphill, and getting closer. And it continued that way until it seemed like it was just outside the window kind of thing, in the yard somewhere. And then it started to go Makai again, but away from us. And the next morning, I asked her, Tutu, what was that we heard last night? She looked at me, and all she said was, meaning that people had come to see me. So I waited till I got back to Honolulu, and I told my mother, she asked me, what happened up there? What did you see? And this kind of thing. And then I told her about this night. And I asked her what it meant. She said, what did Tutu say? I said, Tutu said, and she said, well, you should be honored because the family came to see you and accepted you. And that has always stuck with me. That's the closest I came to night marchers, but she said that's what they were.